let me pause that for a second and we'll go over here. And I'm going to introduce something new. It's not really new. It is, I've talked about, I just haven't been explicit. So here's my option. I'm going to talk about this concept of Europeanization. And I love this word because it's a word that you already know. What's another word for Europeanization? No?
Colonization.
What was it?
Colonization.
Not quite. You know this from the first day of class. Wouldn't we call China's influence on Japan like Chinification? Or Korea's influence on Japan, Koreanification? They're made up words. All they are, it's a phrase to describe cultural diffusion in a particular instance. Makes perfect sense. As Europe is moving all over, and this is not just England, but England and France and the Dutch, right? And all these other countries, they're all mommy countries, and they have mercantile colonies all over. By the 1800s, everybody is on this bandwagon. And so then we have ports. There are two avenues of cultural diffusion. Do you remember the two ways in which we see cultural diffusion most? I'll give you the first one, war. What's the second one? Trade. Okay, so the whole goal of mercantilism, if you are successful, what do you avoid? Keeping in mind what we remember with the American Revolution. What do we avoid? What's one of the lessons of the American Revolutions? What do we want to avoid? We don't want war. We don't want war. This isn't like I'm an empire. I want to kill people for the sake. It's the exact opposite. Because war is really bad for business. Mercantilism is a business model. And so you don't want war if you can help it. But the fact is, can you help it? Because one of the things we know is that the more that your cultural diffusion increases, what's going to happen to that cultural identity? It's gonna change. Do people like this change? No. Sometimes they're willing to fight because they don't want to change. And so even though you don't want war, it's not uncommon that war comes up. But in the mercantile model, you're going to do your best to avoid it. But it's still trade. And the more you trade, you just accelerate the rate of cultural diffusion, which weirdly enough is going to accelerate the change of the cultural identity. So you're going to have wars, even if it's totally not intended. Let's take a second about Middle East. So we have this region. I'm going to make a totally non-scale map, but you'll get the point. So here's the Middle East. It's a crescent. There you go. Totally not. So there's the Middle East. Here's Europe. Okay. So clearly, and here is, by the way, India. India is actually a kite, but it doesn't matter. So which side of the Middle East is going to be most influenced by Europe? Especially this side that used to be like Spain. Heavily influenced, right? Spain is going to be simply Europe. But it's always a little bit different. Even today, it's a little bit different, right? This interchange, heavily influential. What's going to be least European? Should we? Yeah. This would be least. It would be more Indian. But that's a little bit funny. Because India has actually got a very, very, very long history. And so even though we're going to get Europe trading in India, does Europe totally transform India? No. You know this from China. Does Europe totally transform China? No. A very deep cultural identity. They may not have a strong political structure. They don't. But their cultural identity is like 2,000 years old. And so we've got influx. What area is going to be most removed from this? And it's a bad question. So let me just give you a visual. You guys, I can't How about this big desert? Saudi Arabia. Why don't we have a lot of European influence in Saudi Arabia? Super easy answer. I gave it to you when I described it. So it's a big desert. Okay. Why does Europe go in there? No reason for Europe to go in there. There's not a lot of magnet. There's not a lot of attraction. So there's not a lot of European influence. What's the big influence in Saudi Arabia and its regions, the desert regions? Well, you have a lot of tribal influence, even though they're all Muslim now. Have we solved those tribal differences? That difference between Sunni and Shiite, is it totally religious based? No, of course not. It's very strong tribal legacies. And mainly because even though they come up with states, it's not a big strong state. It's certainly not a modern state. So we have tribal influences. We have Islam, which is naturally got a connection between the politics and the theocracy, the theology. And so when our cultural diffusion influences people, these guys almost naturally are going to be, they were already more Sunni, and the fact that they're more Sunni, the cultural diffusion is very high, and it means that this guy tends to be more Western. Turkey is going to be more Western. Are they going to be completely Western? No, they're still Muslim. And Islam is a big difference between Europe, Christian, Jewish, mostly Christian. And so they're still Muslim, but they're going to be more Western. These guys over here are going to actually be more Indian. But these guys, very, very Orthodox. And when the trade starts affecting the cultural diffusion, does this make these people closer together or further apart?
Further apart.
Yes. And that's what the whole Wahhabist is. We are not going to let Europe come in here, affect us. That make sense? Okay. This is all kind of hypothetical. Let's get some specific standards. First of all, Europeanization. What do these two maps represent? This one we talked about. What is this one? That's the English Empire. Now, it used to have, but they failed on that one. So here we have Canada. These are all the English colonies. When they said the sun never sets on the English Empire, that's what they mean. No matter where you are in the globe, the sun is going to shine on some English colony. This is physically, it's huge.
The red or the black?
It's huge. No, the red.
Oh,
Okay. Now, what about this? It's kind of the same thing, but it's not. It's actually showing that there's lots of different countries. Who's the most? There's lots of different colonies. Who's most? England. Now the funny thing here is that we've got Spain, right, up before 1914. If we're looking at maybe 1814, what would the colors look like? You don't have exactly the dates here, but I'll just tell you 1814 would be before this date. What would the colors here be? Mostly the Spanish and the Portuguese. But beginning around 1821, when Mexico revolted, up until 1825, almost one after another, after another, after another. Within a 4 or 5 year period, they just revolted over and over again. What was Spain able to do about it? Nothing. And why? Because when they took the land, they weren't thinking in terms of mercantilism and ports. It was totally about land and people, and putting governors there and people there. Well, they just revolted. And Spain was unable to control. By that time, Spanish power had fallen significantly. By 1914, they didn't have anything. A couple of spots right here. And they don't show this, but Cuba, clearly. Puerto Rico still. Most of the Caribbean islands under some type of colonial, not America. The point, though, is Europeanization is this influence over the world. Who is, in 1914, right before World War I, most influenced by Europe? In terms of a region, we haven't really talked a lot about it at all. But that map gives you a hint. Who's got the most colors?
Africa.
Africa. is really kind of a gateway. Okay? I'm going to go this. France, you got Italy, you got England, you got the Dutch. South Africa, even though they speak English, was never English. It's always Dutch. The Afrikaans, it's Dutch, right? That they coming around to trading, they put a port right there. Well, they end up taking over and separating and dividing up Africa. I'm going to go into this maybe a little bit later. I'll talk about it in a second. But are they going in here to grab slaves?
Not necessarily.
Not at all. The exact opposite. In fact, most of the internal exploration for most of the 15th, 16th, 1700s, European contact is solely on the coast. That's why there's all these little countries along the coast. These are all ports. It was solely on the, nobody went inside. Remember, we talked about this. Europeans don't go running into the African jungles, grabbing people and putting them into ships. If they did that, they would be dead, right? So they trade with Africans who are doing that. Africans are trading with Africans. What's happening is that by the late 1800s, missionaries, England is the source of abolition in the world. Religious. Missionaries hear that the only place where slavery still exists is in Africa. So they're going into Africa, largely to try to end the slavery. Do you guys understand that very old joke? And I don't think anybody actually understands this. Dr. Livingston, I presume. You've heard the phrase, Dr. Livingston. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. It used to be much more common. So Livingston was a missionary. Is lost in the deepest, darkest Africa for 30 years. Some guy goes in and he's trying to find Livingston. He's actually trying to find other things. He's just exploring himself. He goes into this African village. Everybody's black, of course, because it's Africa. And right in the middle of the village is this one guy, white guy. He just walks up to him, 30. Dr. Livingston, I presume, because they're British, right? British, they do things like, Dr. Livingston, I presume? Yeah, how'd you guess? This really isn't as hard as it looks. Okay, the point is that's how the Europe gets inside. It's not about slavery. It's very much about mercantilism. Because what do you have inside? They go in there for religious purposes, but what do you find in there? This is where resources are not the ivory and the gold that everybody wanted to have in the 1600s. It's got fields. You've got farms. You could grow coffee. You could grow cotton. You can grow chocolate. You can actually kind of develop it. And since nobody has strong states here, if you develop it and present order, weirdly enough, the locals kind of flock to you. And they do. Of course, not always, because the whole concept of this cultural diffusion is that the more you're in there, the more they change. The more they change. Some people are big on the change because they got more technology, more stuff. Some people, not so much. Particularly in Africa, who's not going to like this change?
The people.
The tribal leaders, right? This makes perfect sense. So lots of wars in here as well. Okay, let me go back.